We're talking about the growth outlook for China with our next guest, Keyu Jin. She is a global economist, author of the new China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. Welcome to the show. Good to see you, Keyu.
Good to be with you, David. Thank you for having me.
We'll talk about some of the themes of your book and some of the themes of your research, and we'll get your outlook on how the new generation of China is going to play a pivotal role in economic growth. First, let's talk about your outlook for how the relationship between China and the U.S. would progress under a second Trump presidency. Take a look at my screen here. I'd like to read to you a few quotes from the China International Trade Representative. So he said that Wang Xiaowen said on Friday, China would be willing and able to resolve and resist the impact of external shocks, responding to questions about the impact of potential tariffs from U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. We believe that China and the U.S. can maintain a stable, healthy, and sustainable development trend in economic and trade relations, Wang said at a press conference in Beijing. China is also willing to expand areas of cooperation and manage differences with the U.S. So, more broadly speaking, how is the trade war, if you want to call it that still, going to be any different in the second Trump term?
Well, first of all, the Chinese authorities are more experienced in dealing with a Trump-like administration. The first time around, it was kind of a shock. They weren't really sure where this was going. They had no expectations of how to resolve it. I think this time it is a bit different. But you can see from what you've just read so far that China's stance is also different. China is actively taking a more engagement and managed engagement kind of a style approach than the first time around, which was more aggressive, partly because U.S. and China relations is still very important to China. The global economy is important to China, and obviously China faces internal economic challenges. So for a variety of reasons, they would say, in China we say that maybe the weather hasn't changed, but to some degree, let's control the temperature.
So I have two questions regarding the tariffs, but let's talk about how the Chinese economy could potentially withstand 60% tariffs or excess of 60% on all Chinese goods, which is something Trump has threatened to impose. Now, let's assume that this threat is relevant and actually significant and he'll follow through. Could the Chinese economy this time around, 2024 and beyond, withstand the 60% tariff on all imported goods?
China has been preparing itself for a gradual decline in engagement on trade and investment with the U.S. for a long time already. And what's more, we have to recognize that even absent the U.S.-China developments, China's internal structural economic changes has also evolved, which means that as China grows bigger and richer, it is going to look a lot more like the U.S. What does that mean? It is going to become a more closed economy in any case. But that said, 40% of the reduction in trade with the U.S. the first time around during the first trade war was compensated by more trade with other economies. Mm-hmm. So this would be China's strategic focus, is to strengthen alliances, sign up to as many trade agreements as possible and focus on the existing ones, work more with other developing countries. And there is an opportunity here to grasp in terms of relationships with Europe, given that Trump's tariff wars is not solely directed to China alone, but also to the U.S. partners as well.
Who are these other trade partners that China is working with?
Actually, all over Europe. If you just look at the EV sector, renewables, battery, China is investing in factories in Poland and Spain and Hungary. And obviously, there are many other countries that are talking about a collaboration with China. We've recently seen that Europe's existential crisis on these technologies has made them come up with a new potential requirement for an intellectual property transfer from Chinese companies to Europe. How ironic is that, given that only a few years ago they were talking and complaining about Chinese companies asking for technology transfers in return for market access. Now the table has totally turned around, and in order for Chinese companies to access European markets, guess what? The condition is technology transfer.
Do you think there's a shift in attitude between European partners and Chinese companies, even despite perhaps some protests from the American allies that they have to, I guess, not work with China as much?
Well, first of all, is Europe serious about the green transition? I think Europe is more serious than any other place in the world about the green transition, and it is still a serious challenge. Europe has a serious productivity and economic challenge. The UK, since Brexit, needs more than ever more alliances and more trading partners. And what's more, most importantly, Trump marks an anti-globalist, anti-multilateralist, isolationist, desyncretization kind of policy. This could potentially push Europe to work with other countries on a grander and broader scale.
Okay, so economists polled by Reuters believe that perhaps a 40% tariff could be imposed next year, not 60%, but 40%. Now, what would be the appropriate or likely Chinese response if this happens?
Well, Chinese will certainly respond, although I am of the view that China is going to be reluctant to pull more extreme measures that have to do with critical minerals or those where China has a basic monopoly, because in the end it will backfire and it's not good for China anyways. But we have to realize that, first of all, China has been rerouting its trade for the last few years through countries like Mexico and Vietnam, obviously investing more there, foreign direct investments, and trading through these other countries. And as we mentioned, trading with other economies. And so when we talk about things like most favored nation status, well, look, the trade weight, the weighted average of tariffs is already almost at 13%. Half of the goods that China exports to the U.S. is already suffering from pretty high tariffs. So any additional change is not, on these status is really, really quite vacuous. It doesn't really mean that much. And on the areas where China focuses the most, such as what they call the new productive forces, the emerging strategic sectors, EVs and high tech, etc. Well, the U.S. is already not an export destination for China. It's really Europe and other countries. So that's where China is going to focus its relationships on.
So let's talk about tech in the EV sectors now. So as you know, U.S. banned Huawei sales in the U.S. I wonder why China hasn't retaliated by banning Apple and whether or not that could change.
Well, because these kind of technology restrictions, sanctions simply just don't serve the purpose for which it is intended. Look at Huawei. Since it's been sanctioned by Trump, its profits and revenue has soared, and it's been able to come out with the newest handset with the latest innovative features, its own chips, fully utilizing domestic capacity, completely circumventing U.S. restrictions. And guess why they have made such rapid progress? It's not despite, but because of these sanctions. And so these technological restrictions or export controls, as we've seen throughout history, starting from the Napoleonic Wars, they only accelerate the rivals' innovation progress. And also, why ban Apple? Apple is a consumer, consumers like it. It raises consumer welfare. It's good for China. It's good for Chinese investments. That globalist view is China's view. Coming back to our previous question, does China stand, very firmly against this kind of intellectual property transfer to Europe? No. What the state said is it should be a private sector decision. Companies should decide what they want to do and not do in return for market access. It shouldn't be the state mandating it. So that kind of mentality goes to show that China believes in the win-win scenario, at least when it comes to global trade.
Okay. EVs now, as you know, there's a large tariff right now, not even in the future, but currently imposed on Chinese vehicles. How likely is it that we see companies like BYD start or expand any workforce they have already in the U.S., perhaps having manufacturing centers in the U.S. like other foreign car companies already do, to perhaps lower some of these tariffs?
Well, I think that the Chinese opportunity is not like the Japanese opportunity in the 1980s when there was fierce competition coming from Japanese automakers, and they were asked to come in and to invest and build plants and factories in the U.S. Now, do Chinese companies believe that they will enjoy the same kind of privilege and opportunity, or let's call it opportunity? I don't think they do. There's a huge amount of uncertainty when it comes to, selling to the U.S. market for all these geopolitical reasons. And I think the Chinese companies are calibrating this very, very carefully, especially when it comes to big fixed amount of investment. But on the other hand, there's no question that going global is the only way out for Chinese companies, especially top performing Chinese companies. First of all, competition is so ferocious in China. Chinese domestic capacity hasn't reached its potential. The economic downturn is weighing down on the entire economy. So it has to go global. And I think that they will meet some of these requirements and conditions, even the tariffs, and they will still be competitive. Of course, that shrinks the possibilities. But, and then if you look at the broader world, whether it's developing countries, Africa, Latin America, hopefully Europe, there are still lots of opportunities that are afforded to Chinese companies, including the Middle East, of course.
So let's close off on the geopolitical relations between China and the U.S. And we can talk about long-term growth in your book. What then do you think will be any changes to Xi Jinping's priorities over the next 4 years now that Trump is in his second term?
Well, we have seen that the immediate response after the election results was more stimulus. As the U.S. cut Fed rates a little while ago, there was more stimulus. So that, if anything, shows that Chinese government, Chinese authorities, the top leaders are committed to reinstating the pro-growth agenda front and center. They might have parked that for a little bit and put other issues ahead, like social issues, social protection issues, security issues, national security issues, political issues. But given that the economy is still, let's face it, pragmatically important, of critical and pivotal importance given China's economic situation, they are adjusting some of these policies in real time, and they are flexible. They are not wedded to a series of ideological or political agenda. Of course, stability is the most important thing, but the size of what we're seeing in terms of the signal to keep up the stock market, to raise consumption, really to focus on a whole set of economic issues, including welcoming back, to the extent possible, foreign capital, being very warm towards foreign companies. We see that in action right now. That's a pragmatic approach.
Let's assume that Trump ends the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East as soon as he takes office, like he promised on his campaign trail. How would a de-escalation of geopolitical tensions for America change China's foreign policy objectives?
I think the Chinese view is that Trump is more peace-oriented. Again, whether that assumption is right or wrongly interpreted, the Chinese believe that there's likely to be more peace, less warfare in the world. And it is likely to believe that on some of the geopolitical or political issues, there's more room for negotiation with Trump because he is transactional. So on the one hand, the economics could look pretty damaging for the Chinese or the Chinese economy. But on the other hand, there might be other, negotiating room to discuss with Trump. So in that sense, geopolitically, we might be seeing a slightly different roadmap compared to the Biden administration. Obviously, we're talking about the more sensitive areas, South China Sea, Taiwan, and so forth.
On the subject of stimulus, did it work what the Bank of China did in the last 2 months? Is it going to have any lasting impact? Is it enough?
We're still waiting to see the real impact and the how it's going to actually trickle down to the real economy. And that's going to take time if it will work. First of all, we've seen the stock market response in a more positive way. And obviously that has boosted confidence a little bit. So far, we're not really seeing in consumption increases and more kind of a return to normality, if you will. But they expect the effect to take place in a few months. There's always a lag when it comes to these kind of stimulus, and whether it gets to the real economy is another thing to be seen. Is it enough? Well, on and off 10 trillion RMB, potentially even more. Of course, it will be delivered and implemented over time. They will pick, kind of which sectors, when to implement, what will be more effective. It's also a learning curve for them, and so I think there's more to be expected. But so far, no one's really holding their breath.
The decrease in mortgage rates, has that had any impact so far on valuations for the real estate sector?
Well, we're not really seeing that. They're obviously trying to tackle the real estate from both the demand and the supply side, from both ends. We're not really seeing an increase on the demand side because, well, the consumers are still not sure where this is going, right? How long it's going to last? How is the recovery real? Is there going to be a sustained path to recovery? They're not sure. So then, in that sense, they're reluctant to pursue any greater purchases or spending. There's something like 140 million, vacant housing. I think if we look at the real estate sector in the longer term, over the longer period, demand does match supply, of course, at a new equilibrium, because there's still a lot of pent-up demand for housing from the rural area. Let's not forget the hundreds of millions of undereducated and underemployed population in the rural areas. They want to be in the cities to have access to social infrastructure, including good health and education. So they want an apartment in the cities. The Chinese government has also been approaching from the supply side, turning a lot more of these vacant housing into affordable housing. This is putting the social issues in front of the economic issues. Public housing, taking inspiration from the Singapore model, and also village reconstructions, and so to speak, taking some of these vacant properties and turning them around and things like that, and also having a whitelist for property developers. These are the property developers that need to stay healthy or stay alive, if you will, to make sure there's no greater challenge to the financial system. So there is an adjustment. There's no major collapse in sight, but it might be a more lengthy, painful process of adjustment.
So just a bit of context for the viewers, Evergrande, it was one of the world's largest and most valuable real estate companies, collapsed in 2021. Many sectors within the real estate industry in China have been in a crisis ever since then. Many developers have defaulted. You've already stated the vacancy numbers. How has this crisis, the real estate crisis, affected consumer spending, savings patterns, and so on?
First of all, Chinese saving is tied to the real estate, and to a much greater extent than in the U.S. or advanced economies, mostly because the opportunities of financial saving is limited in China. If you put it in the stock market, you probably haven't got any real returns realized in the last 20 years. So the majority of assets are tied to housing, and people like to own a property rather than rent it for a variety of security reasons and privilege status implications.
Yes.
So there is a real wealth effect with property. First off, there's a confidence issue because if your real estate, the wealth part of your real estate is uncertain, then you're more loath to consume. So I think that is a very important part of the reduction in consumption. Also, more broadly speaking, the real estate by and large accounted for 30% of Chinese GDP. And so all the employment, the construction, the materials, the financing linked to it, it's a very, very sizable part of the economy. And so, it's true that in the past, people saved a lot, in part because they wanted to afford housing. People had fewer kids because they complained that housing prices are too high. I think both of these are true. And a lot of the increase in saving is also driven by rising inequality in China. The other thing that has happened in China is that as the Chinese economy slowed down, as there have been talks about common prosperity, as there have been regulatory crackdowns on technology and finance and other sectors, it has really had a dampening effect on the rich people's wealth or perceived wealth as well.
Okay, so this leads to your research on how the next generation of consumers may be different than the previous generation. First of all, this property crisis that we're witnessing in China, will that prompt the new generation, or even the current generation, to change the way they store their wealth from real estate to something else?
Well, first of all, there's a cultural difference between Chinese families and many others, especially in the Western Europe and the West, let's say, because the entire family saves on a property for the young people, for the young generation. So there's a lot more intra-family risk sharing, intra-family consumption sharing, if you will. We joke about the fact that young people, despite having much lower income growth or income, and are able to afford San Francisco housing prices in Beijing because they have 6 wallets behind them, right? Their parents, the spouse's parents, and so forth. And that's a cultural phenomenon. I'd say that the housing pressure is very real, and it's especially real for young generation. If we look at Hong Kong and how all this, the chaotic things that, enveloped, sorry, let me start that sentence again. If we look at Hong Kong and what had happened to the young generation and their grievances, a lot of it had to do with expectations that they will be living in a shoebox, despite, no matter how hard they worked, if they could afford it. So this is a very critical, not only economic issue, but also social issue. And I think this is also one reason why the government is so focused on not only kind of preventing a bubble or the bubble from enlarging, but also turning a lot of the housing into affordable housing, is also to appease the younger generation. And in terms of how their behavior will change, well, I think more saving. That's the answer to everything, and that's not good for the economy, is it? Because if everybody's safe, then there's then the consumption is still suppressed, and it just doesn't make the economy go around. So unless they're able to tackle some of these big issues, I think that consumption is going to be low on a household level. But that said, turning to the most important thing, which is the new generation, they do have very, very different consumption habits. Radically.
Can you tell us about some of these differences?
Yeah, if you look at the statistics, it is striking that despite earning much less income than, let's say, those born in the 1970s, let's say 1990s cohort, they spend twice as much per capita on clothing, something like, almost 50% more on food and traveling. They spend a lot more.
Wait, is that because they have more money, or is that just relative to the total income?
Despite having less money, they spend more per capita. Why? Because they care about life, right? The previous generation cared about work. They were all about working hard and saving that extra few dollars for all these responsibilities. Now, part of the reason is that they're also born into a more prosperous environment. Some of them have families that can take care of them. They don't feel the pressure anymore, and they want to have a good time. This is the new generation, right? It's not all about work. It's a work-lifestyle balance. This is why the China that the whole world was so scared about, these competitive, super hardworking, persistent, perseverant, Foxconn workers. Well, that's not necessarily the new generation anymore. But at the same time, the new generation is also more innovative, right? They think more beyond the box. So they can be very creative and very economically impactful, but they do like to spend. So I think if China is able to get over the current economic hump, the cycle, and these young generations' economic powers can be fully utilized, you would have a much bigger consuming nation than a saving nation.
So you think that the GDP will shift more towards services, technology, less on manufacturing?
Absolutely, it's already happening. First of all, because of the technology-enabled service trade or services, China's service productivity growth is higher and higher. China's service exports is increasing. Services also offer more jobs, and they offer more jobs to more productive, more educated younger people. So although I have to say the national strategic focus is still on manufacturing or new age manufacturing, because the Chinese leadership believes that you've got to make stuff in order to be powerful, and it can't just be kind of a vacuous thing.
Well, do you think that the psyche or the outlook on life for the new generation will make China more or less productive? In other words, can the new generation still be competitive in the global workplace?
I think yes, but in a very different way. That's why I think that China is firmly entering into a new era because of the new generation. It's going to be a lot less about manual labor, low cost, cheap labor, and sheer hard work and, let's say, persistence. I think it's going to be a lot more focused on, let's say TikTok or Shein. Don't you find it ironic that despite U.S.-China relations, that 4 out of the 5 most downloaded apps in the U.S. are Chinese?
Yeah.
They're all made by Chinese new generation, right? They are smart in a different way. They're hardworking, but in a very different way. But a lot of it is actually about real life, right? They're looking at what is needed, what's demanded in real life. Because why? Because they are afforded the opportunity. They're no longer in factories, lining up in factories. They observe, they look, they enjoy life. They get inspiration from everyday life. And that's what's causing them to be very innovative. Plus, of course, China's manufacturing capacity, supply chain efficiency actually gives China a very unique privilege because you need all of them. The UK has great talent and great universities, but doesn't have the manufacturing capacity. So it's limited in terms of what its startups can do. In China, you have a big market base, you have these innovations, you have the manufacturing supply chain capacity. It is able to churn out very creative companies, and that's what the new generation is focused on. But of course, the new generation is under much more pressure than the previous generations going globally because of what's going on geopolitically.
That was my next question, actually, is the changes to emigration from China in the new generation. Will we see a larger or smaller diaspora of Chinese people around the world in the next couple of decades?
This is hard to say because, when I was going to school, or a little bit before when I was going to school in the U.S., people wanted a job in the U.S. They wanted to stay in the U.S. That was kind of the dream. And then a few years after I graduated, it started that Chinese students were returning. If we talk about voting by your feet, according to some statistics, more than 80% of Chinese students have returned to their homeland, since 2013 or something like that. And so a lot of them went back to China because there are more opportunities, economic growth is high, and they think they have a fairer opportunity. That may still change, go back the other way around because of the recent economic challenges. In the last 10 years, one got to admit that all these, unicorns formation, the private equity, venture money, obviously that was in China. This is shifting a little bit, but there's also the pressure coming from the other way, which is that given the U.S.-China relations, a lot of Chinese students or Chinese employees are feeling the pressure in the U.S. A lot fewer opportunities than in the past. I mean, certainly for academia, certainly for sensitive sectors like chemistry, biology, and other things, and even for education. You see fewer Chinese students choosing the U.S. As a destination for university because of the perceived discrimination, if you will.
Will the new generation enhance or erode the grip and power of the CCP, you think?
Well, that's an interesting and tough question to answer. Let me just first of all say that I still see the new generation as a very positive force for China because they are, if I may say so, better at communication. They are multicultural, multilingual. Many of them have had education backgrounds in other countries before they returned to China. Their outlook is invariably global. They are much closer to the millennials and Gen Zs of other nations around the world than the previous generations, and they care a lot about the issues that all generations, Gen Zs and millennials, care about, like social issues, environmental issues, having a more humanist look, a view of the world, right? You got to see that China came from a very poor nation, a backwaters, and so their mentality, the hunger, the ambition of the previous generations was a product of economic circumstances, and so the cycle is renewed. They get more prosperous. The new generation doesn't have to think about being so hungry and so ambitious, so they focus a lot more on the broader issues around the world, and they have more to talk about with the rest of the world. And I think communication is key. Look at how the leaders are communicating these days between U.S. China. A lot of the misgivings and misunderstandings are because of lack of perspective and opportunities. I think all of this, by and large, I think the new generation will make China's soft power become stronger.
So let's close off on the longer term outlook for Chinese growth. So as you know, one of the, problems for all economies, not just all the major economies, not just China, is population decline. The fertility rate of China in particular is below 2, and it's projected by the United Nations that sometime in the next century, possibly by 2100, the population will shrink by half. China has reversed its one-child policy, but that doesn't seem to slow this trend. What can be done?
First of all, is the number of people in a country still going to be as important for an economy as it was in the past? That's the question we got to ask, because we're simultaneously talking about how AI is going to rapidly displace so many kind of jobs. And it's the technology that matters. It's the productivity that matters. It's going to completely transform the workplace. And so I think technology, demographics, all of that is interrelated. And at the same time, despite China's fertility decline, China still has 25 million missing vacant jobs in manufacturing. Nobody wants to fill them, because there's a skill and education mismatch more than a demographic population decline. So I think that demographics does not explain China's way up, and it's not going to explain its way down. The question really is on technology, and the question is on how to productively deploy people's resources and human capital and transition the workers to a new workplace and landscape. Whichever country is able to manage that is going to fare much better both on an economic and social level than another.
So you think a supply of labor is not going to have a problem in the future?
First of all, China still have hundreds of millions of people in the rural areas. They have low wages. China is not suffering from inflation, high, pressurized labor markets, and rapidly rising wages. So even internally, there's a lot of more additional underemployed labor, undereducated labor that can be utilized. So this is not, I don't believe that demographics is China's short-term challenge. Yes, there's fiscal pension plans, but hey, look around the world. U.S. does not have a demographics problem, and it has one of the greatest and most warning deficits, right? Fiscal deficits. We don't need an aging population to have these kind of economic challenges.
What about an aging population? Would that change spending patterns? Would that add pressure on the government to fund more social security and welfare and so on?
Absolutely. This is where I would agree with you. How do you take care of the elderly? How do they take care of themselves? Are they going to save more? And also with longevity increasing, there might be more saving, not less. There's going to be a rapidly rising gray economy opportunity in China, whether it's hospitals or taking care of the elderly. But also China is a country with intra-family altruism, if you will, the thing we talked about. So it's not solely reliant upon Social Security. Children take care of their parents, and there's a lot of inter-family transfers. But I think it is more the aging aspect that you mentioned that is more of a challenge than the productive economic kind of potential that China faces.
Okay, well, finally, let's close off on other themes of your book we haven't covered yet, the new China Playbook. We haven't discussed whether or not China can become the next world superpower for tech. Shenzhen will be the next Silicon Valley.
China has all the potential to be the foremost competitive technological player in the world. In some ways, it already is. A developing country with 25% of the living standards of US and Europe making cutting-edge technology that we're already seeing. China's has advantage and disadvantages. Its advantage is what we've seen already. This whole of a nation program where you mobilize political centralization with economic decentralization at the city level to build supply chains, coordinate, mobilize, rally, resources, like China reaps Olympic gold medals. It's the same kind of effort, and it dominates in EVs and batteries and solar panels within a very short period of time because of that concerted effort. That is China's strength. But on the other hand, because of the social issues that have become so important to China because of this administration, this leadership, it has hurt other areas. It has dampened the potential. Let's take finance, right? You cannot have the most innovative entrepreneurial economy without the most robust and healthy financial sector, just like in the U.S. Yet finance has been curbed. The financial system is under regulatory scrutiny. That, I think, has substantially curbed China's potential. So it is still very much a question mark. I think that, again, China is already a big player, but unless it can do the short term well, even it has the greatest long-term plans, long-term strategic plans, they won't be reached until they get the short-term macro right.
Okay. Well, great to catch up. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Where can we learn from you and read your work?
I think that my book has summed up what we don't understand or what we misunderstand about the Chinese economy. I write op-eds for the FT, New York Times, Project Syndicate, and many other outlets, and I will be publishing more academic works on U.S.-China technology competition.
Okay, excellent. So we'll put the link to the book down below. Make sure to follow her there. Thank you very much, Keyu. We'll speak again soon. Take care.